Okay, this is going to be the first part of a three-part series in purchase contracts. It is so important and so complicated that we're going to spend 3 weeks, so the next 3 Tuesdays, including today, we're going to split up the contract. We're going to go through every single paragraph of it. We're also videotaping this, so be on your best behavior. And because we want to be able to use this as a training tool so that new agents are able to watch the video and learn really the importance of the contract. Okay, so what we're going to do today is we're going to break down sections A through F. So what you have are just the contract sections A through F. And it'll probably take most of the day to get through this. We're going to read through each paragraph, and so that you understand what each paragraph means, because really, honestly, who here has read through every page of the purchase contract?
Like really read it? Like
Yeah, yes, read, word for word.
Read it.
In fact, nobody knows, nobody's looking because you don't have the whole contract. How many pages are there?
13?
Okay. Okay, so there are 12 pages to the purchase contract, 14 pages to the purchase contract. And you have to know what each one says because there are implications on the contract with your client. In fact, it starts off here. You don't have the, oh yeah, the first page. It's not on the screen. But if you see here, it says in big, bold writing right here. Adam, can you read this really loud? The one that says under the purchase in the big, bold, all capital letters. Loud.
Under the purchase? This one.
This part, right? Yes.
This purchase contract becomes a legally binding contract for the purchase of real estate upon execution by both parties.
Okay, so what did it say? It becomes a legally binding contract. Okay, so there are legal implications and ramifications when your client signs it. You have to be aware of that. If something goes wrong and they weren't told about something on the contract, who do you think they're going to sue?
The agent.
Among other people, you. Right? So you have to be aware of what needs to be, what they need to be aware of. Part of your job as an agent is what? Remember in licensing law, we talk about agency, right? And what is the key word in agency? What are your duties? It starts with an F and ends with fiduciary.
Fiduciary.
Okay? You have a fiduciary duty to your client. What does that mean?
Loyalty.
Loyalty. What else?
Confidentiality.
Confidentiality. You have a duty to protect them, right? That's the purpose. That's one of the biggest reasons why they're hiring you as an agent. Okay, so right here it says, this is a legally binding contract. And you have to be aware of what each paragraph says. So that's why we're going to take so much time for the next 3 weeks and run through every single paragraph so you know how to explain it if asked. I also caution you as we start this that you are not able to give legal advice, right? As a real estate agent, it is not lawful for you to give legal advice. But when they ask you questions, you can explain what it means, but not what their implications are. So just be careful that when you give your clients advice, that you're not giving them legal advice, okay? So going back up to up above, what it starts with is just, first of all, it says reviewed by. Okay, all contracts, before they go out to the client, must be reviewed by either the principal broker or the broker in charge. Okay, so, and then the broker in charge, or whoever reviews it, is signing it. Okay, so just be aware that before you present contracts to your clients, it has to be reviewed by one of the principals, or the principal, or one of the brokers, okay? Then you're gonna fill in the reference date. The reference date has little to do with anything other than that's gonna be the reference date for the contract. But it doesn't mean that's the date that you're having signed, or that's the date you're having presented. No, it's a date really that you drafted the contract. And then the property reference, and if you remember in real estate license class, that the property reference is just the address, the physical address of the property is good enough. It doesn't have to be a legal description. and then the tax map key. And it's filled in here, okay? So that's gonna be the top part of it. That's just saying this offer is on for this property. Okay, any questions? So now we go into what each section of the contract is. So section A is about agency disclosure. Notice that it's the first page of the contract because it's the most important part. Okay, so there's two sections of section A, or two paragraphs, paragraph 1 and paragraph 2. So Kylie, can you start by reading paragraph 1? And then we'll stop at, just a different breakdown. So just read this part right here.
Agency buyers and or sellers in a real estate transaction in Hawaii may retain a real estate brokerage firm as their agent. In such case, buyer and or seller is represented by the brokerage firm and all of its licensees. Hawaii law requires real estate licensee to disclose orally or in writing to seller and or buyer whom the licensee represents. The form of representation may be one of the following.
Okay, good. Adam, continue.
A seller's agent. Brokerage firm represents seller only unless a disclosed dual agency exists. Seller's agent owes the highest duties to seller, including confidentiality, loyalty and due care and diligence.
Okay. Henry.
Buyer's agent. Brokerage firm represents buyer only unless a disclosed dual agency exists. Buyer's agent owes the highest duties to buyer, including confidentiality, loyalty, and due care and diligence.
Nagomi. C.
Dual agent. Brokerage firm represents both buyer and seller. This commonly occurs when licensees in the brokerage firm representing seller have buyer clients looking for types of property similar to seller's property. In such event, the brokerage firm and all of its licensees represent both buyer and seller and the dual agent. Dual agent must remain neutral in negotiations and must not advance the interest of one party over the other. A separate dual agency consent addendum is required under Hawaii law.
Okay, good. And then Richard, you get the long one.
No agency representation.
Okay.
See
So-
paragraph A2B below.
Okay, so what agency, this section here, paragraph A1, is just disclosing or notifying the client the types of agency. Yeah, that's what this paragraph is saying. So it's saying here, seller's agent, the buyer's agent, or dual agency. And in the case of agency where there's a seller's agent or buyer's agent, the entire company represents the client, and not the agent, the entire company. In fact, you'll see as we go to the next paragraph or next section that you don't fill in your name on it. You're putting in the company's name, because it's the broker that's actually the agent for the client, and you're an agent to the broker. Okay, so in this case, remember, everybody in the office represents the client. In the case of dual agency, then the one company represents both. And it says here that agency disclosures have to be made, or dual agency disclosure, and consent has to be given. Okay, so remember, that's the important part, is that dual agents have to have consent of the parties. Okay, paragraph 2, this is the disclosure part. So the first part is just saying what agency is, what it means. And paragraph 2 is notifying all the parties who represents who. Okay, so over here, who wants to take it? Donna? Why don't you start? Disclosure, paragraph A.
Seller representation. Seller is represented by the brokerage firm blank and all its licensees. Brokerage firm is or is not a member of the National Association of Realtors.
Okay, good. So what it's saying is seller is represented by blank. In the blank, what goes there?
And the realty?
Well, the company name, yes. If we represent the seller, then yes, it would be iNet Realty. But it's whatever the company, so the company name goes in there, not the agent's name, and the brokerage firm. On the templates, in the zip forms that all of you should have template or accounts for, if you pull up a template for the purchase contract, some of these things will already be filled in, such as buyer representation, because if you're writing a contract, generally you're representing the buyer. So when in our template on zip forms, the agency or this part B will already be filled in. It'll say iNet Realty here, and it'll be already filled in. Okay. Dual agency is if we're representing both parties. Okay, so the brokerage firm, and you would put iNet Realty, is a member, and we're representing both parties. Okay? In the case of dual agency, then a separate dual agency addendum needs to be attached to this. Okay? But just understand in the templates, the default is for buyer's representation. So if that's not the case, then you have to change some of these things. Donna?
In what case, the brokerage firm is not a member of the National Association of Realtors. In what case would it not be a member of the National Association of Realtors?
Good question. So the question is, when would this be checked is not?
Yeah.
If a broker that's representing one of the parties is not a member of the Honolulu Board of Realtors or the others.
Oh, but it says National Association of Realtors.
Yeah, so remember, to be a member of the Honolulu Board of Realtors, you're required to be a member of the Hawaii Association of Realtors as well as the National Association of Realtors. In fact, for Realtor Association, you're actually a member of the National Association of Realtors, technically. And then you're required to be members of the sub associations under that. That's why it says National Association of Realtors, because you have to be a member of the National Association, and by virtue of that, you're required to be members of all the others. It's not the reverse.
How could they be a broker then and not be a member of the National Association of Realtors?
So if you have it, because association is voluntary, right? You don't have to be a member of the
Yeah.
National Association of Realtors.
So how
Right.
can they represent it there? I guess I don't.
Well, because I could have a real estate license and not be a member of the Board of Realtors.
And you can still practice.
And I still have a license to practice real estate. I can still represent clients with agency. Okay, so it's an association, right? So as long as you have a real estate license, that's all you need is a real estate
You
license.
still have to be under a brokerage.
Yes, but don't mistake that. You're mistaking two different things. So the real estate license, right? So the Hawaii state gives a real estate broker's license or salesperson's license, right?
Mm-hmm.
Can I sell real estate if I have one of these two licenses? Yes. It's not a trick question. Yes, you can. Right? Can I use the trademark Realtor if I'm just a broker and I haven't subscribed to the National Association? So now I have the NAR, which also is mandatory for the HAR and the HBR. Okay? These are all trade associations. Membership in there is voluntary. Okay? But don't confuse the two. Right? They're two separate things. One is the license and one is just an association. So there are rules on who has to be a member. Because iNet Realty is a association member, then all of our agents under us are required. That's a association rule. It's not a licensing requirement, it's an association rule. They're two different things.
So there could be a brokerage that's not.
There's lots. In fact, there's.
That are listed in the MLS and everything?
No, they won't
But
be in the
won't be on
MLS. They will
right.
not be in the MLS.
Yeah.
So don't
Yeah.
you're
Okay.
confusing
Okay,
things
now-
now.
yeah.
Okay, so to
Yeah.
make it a little clearer, there are about 6,000 members of the Honolulu Board of Realtors. About 6,000, give or take. Anybody want to guess how many licensed real estate agents there are in Hawaii?
3 times.
About 29,000. Okay, see the difference? Every one of the 29,000, well, if they're active, I don't know how many are active, but as long as you're active, you can sell real estate. I don't have to be a member of the board to sell real estate. So that's why it says is or is not. Okay, good question. Does that make sense? Okay. It is a common misconception that all brokers are realtors. That's not the case. In fact, by looking at the numbers, most aren't realtors.
They must not be doing it, and they must not be doing that.
Not true. Most commercial brokers are not realtors.
Oh, okay.
Okay?
Yeah.
Good. That's good discussion.
But all salespersons will work with a broker, yeah?
Yes, all salespersons must be associated with a broker. Absolutely. Okay? So this section 2 is talking about agency disclosure. Who represents who? This is really important. You always have to disclose who represents who. Okay, any questions on that? And also make sure you understand here, if there is a dual agency, then it must be disclosed in writing and consent has to be given to them before signing the contract. Okay? Section B. Section B now talks about the initial earnest money deposit. So what this is saying is, if we read through it, the initial earnest money deposit received from, so the buyer's name would go in there. Okay? Now, if there's two people, a husband and wife, you don't have to put both names in there. You're just going to put whoever wrote the check. All right? So if it came from Mr. Smith, then Mr. Smith's name would be in there. Who is the buyer? Okay? And then the sum of the amount of the earnest money check that you get. So you'll fill it in there. And then you're also going to disclose in the form of an hour in the INET template. It actually, with the template says in an uncashed personal check. We disclose it's an uncashed personal check. And that is an initial earnest money deposit. And the initial earnest money deposit shall be deposited in escrow by the next business day after acceptance date or otherwise agreed to by the parties. So what does that mean? If you have an uncashed personal check and the offer gets accepted, when is it due in escrow?
So the next business.
The next business day. Okay, it says it there very clearly when it's due in there. And then it says received by, and received by is going to be your name. And I'm not sure what it says there.
Nothing.
But it says the received by is the agent, yourself, you, who's receiving that personal check. And actually, this is where you would sign it. You sign it here, and your name goes in here, and then your information below. Okay, so now you're responsible. You're the person that's saying you've received the check. By signing that, you're certifying on a legally binding contract that you physically received a personal check or whatever you're putting in, cash or whatever it is, okay? Don't ever take cash as an earnest money deposit, by the way. Because if you do, we have to put it into a trust account and account for it, and it's a big pain. So don't receive cash as an earnest money deposit. Okay, any questions on this part? Section B2. This is a paragraph that most people don't even read or know. What does it say, Richard?
One, opening of escrow unless buyer instructs escrow otherwise, any interest on buyer's deposits shall automatically accrue to the benefit of escrow.
Okay, so what does that mean?
They put it into their account, and while it's sitting there, they're getting interest.
Exactly. They're collecting interest on it. So what if the client says, hey, why does escrow get to keep the interest? I want it. Can they?
So if they agree upon, yeah.
Well, it's not so much agreed upon because it's whoever's money it is. So in this case, it would be the buyer's money. So the seller doesn't have to agree to it. But this is the thing. Escrow will set up an interest-bearing account. If a buyer says, hey, I want interest on the account, on the money, escrow will set up an interest-bearing account for them. But the amount they charge to set up that account is going to far outweigh any interest they get on it. Okay, so unless you're dealing with property that's $100 million and the earnest money and deposits are $20 million, then you really aren't going to mess around with it. You know, even if it's a large sum, which they think is a large sum, you know, if you calculate interest on even $100,000 over a month, what escrow will charge them to set it up is going to be more than what they'll get in interest. So 99.999% of the time, you're not going to set up an extra account. But be aware of it. If a buyer says, hey, I want the interest, you have to be able to know, okay, you can collect interest, but just be aware that escrow will charge you to set up a separate account for yourself. And you're going to be charged a sum that's going to be more than any interest you earn.
Do we
Okay?
know about how much they usually charge?
I do not. I do know that, well, what's $100,000 times 1% interest divided by 12 months? Who's got a calculator real quick?
100,000 in 1 year, less than 100 a month.
Yeah, less than $100.
90.
Okay, and they're gonna charge you more than that to set it up. Okay, and that's if deposits, because generally deposits aren't 100,000, right? Yeah, I mean, the down payment may be 100,000, but that's coming at closing. It's not sitting in the account. Usually you'll have $1,000 to $5,000 in earnest money, and then maybe an additional $5,000, depending on the size of the property, maybe $10,000 in additional deposits, but that's it. Okay, we're not talking about the whole down payment sitting in escrow the whole time. It's just the earnest money and the additional deposit, which is probably no more than 10 grand, which now you're talking about $10 of interest. Okay, so it's not worth it. Okay, but be aware of it. Again, a lot of things are how to explain things to your client when they ask the question. If they ask this question, you need to be able to talk about it, okay? C, the next section, addenda. C, section C, we're talking about all of the addenda that can be attached to the contract. Right? The addenda, the standard contract, the purchase contract is 14 pages. Okay? And that only includes the normal things in a contract. If it were to include everything that's not relevant, then the contract will become 28 pages, and there's no reason for it. Because in most cases, you would be marking them NA, NA, NA. But there are circumstances where the contract doesn't include certain things. For instance, leasehold disclosures or lead-based paint disclosures. And in those cases, then you need to add on the addenda, and these are some of the most common. You notice that there's blanks to fill in whatever you're going to put on. Okay? So these are the most common addenda in our template. The two that are already automatically templated is the as-is condition and the lead-based paint disclosure. Okay? If you're not going to add them on, you can just uncheck them. Or if you need to add on things like the leasehold disclosure or short sale disclosure or addenda, then you have to check those, okay? Section D. Bless you.
Bless you.
We're gonna edit that out.
Okay, sounds good.
Section D now is the offer to buy and the purchase price. So the first section, D1 of section D, is talking about the offer. Okay, all offers have an expiration date. Okay, it's not where you put an offer on and it's good forever. An offer has an exception date. What does it say, Henry? Read it out loud, real loud.
Offer to buy. Buyers offers to buy the property described below on the terms and conditions contained in his purchase contract, and agrees that his purchase contract shall be binding if accepted by the seller on or before the date,
Okay.
time.
Yeah. And so that's where you're gonna put in how long it is. What happens if a seller doesn't respond to it within that time frame?
It's expired.
The offer is expired. Is there any ramifications? Not really. Because if a seller doesn't respond in time and the buyer really wants the property, and the seller says, well, I need more time, what's the buyer gonna say? Nope, you missed it. Probably not. They're probably gonna say, yeah, go ahead. Okay, so, legalese, yes, there is an expiration of it. In the practice of real estate, you know, what's the buyer gonna say? Nope, you missed it. No, maybe in a buyer's market, but not in a seller's market. Okay, any questions?
So when he puts up an offer, he can also put a contingency clause in the offer.
What contingency clause?
Like if he sells his house,
That's on the later, that's a later contingency. Good question. Okay, the next paragraph. D2 is the purchase price. Okay? So you have to know how to fill this in. So the first section is the earnest money deposit. Do you know where that comes from?
personal check.
No, do you know where that amount is found?
Oh, sorry.
B1.
It's found in B1, right here, right? In B1, you're saying received from so-and-so the amount of X, whatever that number is, that's the number that goes in here. Okay, that's the number that goes in here, the initial earnest money deposit. Okay? Generally, if the property is under 500,000, $1,000 to $5,000 is appropriate.
From under 500,000 up to 5,000.
Yeah. If this number is really small, it makes your offer less attractive, right? The more money that's we call it skin in the game. The more money that this earnest money deposit is, the more serious the buyer is,
Oh yeah.
right? If two offers are identical, one offer is $1,000 deposit, earnest money, and one offer is $10,000 earnest money, all other things being the same, equal, which offer is going to be the better offer?
10,000.
The one that has more earnest money, right? Just means it's a more serious buyer. Could mean a more serious buyer. The second part is the additional deposit. Okay, so that's saying, first is the earnest money that the buyer is putting up. And the second part is, okay, once we pass a certain point, so it says here, paid into escrow, additional deposit if paid into escrow on or before, and there's a date that there's an additional money to be paid in. If this amount, the earnest money is $1,000, seller typically is going to want more than that once the inspection period is over. Okay, just expect that. And so what you want to do, always keep in mind when you're drafting offers is, I want to write an offer that gets accepted, not countered. The better an offer you can write up front, the better chance you have of it being accepted without it being countered. Does that make sense? So if I know that I'm only putting down $5,000 or $1,000 here, and generally, unless it's a $50,000 property, that the seller is going to want more money than that, then I'm going to just presume and assume that they're going to counter me if I leave this part blank. You don't have to put an additional deposit. In fact, you don't even have to put down an earnest money deposit. But there's no weight behind the contract, the offer, if there's no money behind it. Okay? So if I'm only putting down $1,000 here, then I'm going to expect that the seller is going to want more money after the inspection. Okay? And in this market, it's pretty reasonable to expect that you're going to have to put about $5,000 total. So if I put $1,000 here, I'd probably put $4,000 or $5,000 additional deposit. And then it says paid into escrow on or before. You want to put some. You have to put some time frame there. And that's a good way to say 3 business on or before 3 business days after the removal of J1. What's J1? The inspection period. So we'll get into that. We'll get into the inspection clause and spend a lot of time on that one because that one's a big one. Okay. So this one says on or before 3 days after the removal of J1. Okay. 3 business days. But again, make sure that always thinking, is that going to be attractive to the seller? Do you want that countered? A seller might say, no, 3 business days is too long. Right? If the J1 ends on a Thursday, I really don't have to get deposits, my additional deposit in until Tuesday of the next week. That's a long time to go an additional 4 or 5 days without having to put additional deposits in. Okay? And then the down payment, the next section will be the balance of the down payment. Okay? And so you have to do a little bit of math in your head when you're doing this.
So it's $1 million property.
So if the property is, let's do a little exercise. If the purchase price is $100,000, okay, and the earnest money is $1,000, and the additional deposit is another $1,000, and my down payment is 20%, how much is this?
18,000.
How'd you calculate that? So the answer is 18,000. So it's 20% of the purchase price, which is how much?
20,000.
Equals 20,000 less the 2 amounts I already have there, right? Because these deposits, earnest money and the initial and the additional, are both going to be credited towards the down payment. Okay? So if this is 2,000, I'm going to subtract the 2,000 there. And my additional, can you mute my phone there, please? Thank you. You guys get that? Because I'm not sure, zip forms auto-calculate some things. I know it auto-calculates this number, but I don't think it calculates that one. I'm not sure, but you have to be aware of how you fill these things out, okay? In case you may have a form, you know, a blank contract, a hard copy, and you're gonna fill it out by hand. So just know what these are. You guys understand this? So this part, what goes in this part? So the total cash funds from buyer will equal what?
Down
The
payment.
20%. Good. And then, so how much then would be the loan?
80%.
80%, which is
$80,000.
$80,000. So when it says by way of, the additional
Conventional.
is gonna be the $80,000. Okay, that's the amount that's gonna be financed. And then by way of, if it's a conventional mortgage, you're gonna put a conventional mortgage. If it's FHA, you need to put FHA, VA, Hula May, whatever it is. If there's special financing like FHA, VA, Hula May, or USDA, you need to disclose that. The reason is that there are some implications for the seller for certain loans. Right, like FHA and VA, there are there are non-allowables for the buyer. Non-allowables mean there are costs, you know, fees associated with the closing that the VA or FHA, both of those loans say the buyer is not allowed to pay. In which case, who pays it?
The loan giver, the bank or lender.
The lender never pays
Or
it. They
VA.
may waive it, but they don't pay it. But if
VA,
it's
okay.
not waived,
It's on
if the seller, if the buyer doesn't pay it, who pays it? Adam said it, the seller.
The seller.
And that's why you need to disclose by way of, if it's VA or FHA especially, that because the seller's gonna incur some of those costs that the buyer is not allowed to pay.
So what is will to the disadvantage of the seller then, if she is being billed for other fees?
It could be. So again, it goes back to making your offer attractive. If you are competing against a cash buyer or competing against conventional financing, then you have a disadvantage, yeah, because it costs
Yeah.
the buyer or costs the seller a little bit of money. Not a lot, but you know, just be aware of it. Little things can tilt tilt things in your favor or against you. So be aware of that.
That's why cash is better than doing the conventional mortgage, because
Sure. Cash is always king.
yeah, there's no restriction on the seller to sell it.
Yeah. And then the total purchase price will be all of these things added up. We'll carry down to here. Okay? This, I'm pretty sure, is auto-calculated in zip form. Any questions? Pardon?
Good so far.
Also, pardon?
Say it's good so far.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Good for buyer, yeah.
By way of, I just want to get it on camera. What'd you say?
Very good.
Okay. By way of, make sure that you have this, that it doesn't say, there are some terms, there's some wording to be aware of if you're the leasing agent.
Sorry.
And also to not use if you're the buyer's agent, okay? So I've seen contracts that still today will say at a mortgage of the buyer's choice at rates and terms acceptable to the buyer. Okay, don't ever use that. Rates and terms acceptable to the buyer. Because almost always you will get countered by the seller. And if you're the seller and an offer comes in with that, rates and terms acceptable to the buyer, you counter that. You don't ever accept a contract like that. Right? Because you could be 21 days into escrow, and all of a sudden the buyer says, you know, after they pass J1, They've passed the seller's disclosure period. They passed all contingencies except waiting for the loan. And really by then it should be smooth sailing. And the buyer's agent calls you up because you're the listing agent and said, oh, buyer's canceling. No, they can't. Why are they gonna cancel? Well, because we put here, at rates and terms acceptable to the buyer, and the buyer just got the disclosure of the rates and terms and they don't like it, so they're canceling. You don't want them to have a way out because of that. Something as simple and stupid as that. So when you're the when you're a listing agent, always look at this to make sure what are they putting down is by way of. If it says that, that should be an automatic counter. As a buyer, don't ever use that because you will get countered. Okay?
But the buyer used that to protect his escrow. It's a way out for him.
It can be. So as a listing agent, you don't want to have these loopholes open. I had a very notable real estate agent here try to pull that on me. Okay? I mean, top producer, and he knew better, but I think something happened where he was looking for a way to get out for his client, and he used that, and I said, no, you're not gonna use that. Okay, so you don't want to ever have that situation or conversation. Richard, read this part.
Failure by buyer to make any of the scheduled deposits as required by this purchase contract shall constitute a default, and seller may elect to terminate this purchase contract pursuant to paragraph O-1.
What does that mean?
Bad credit.
Pardon?
Bad credit of the buyer.
No,
failure.
not bad credit. They're saying, so it says failure for the buyer to make any scheduled deposits. That doesn't mean that they're not qualifying for the loan. If they don't qualify for the loan, that's a separate issue. That'll come under the financing contingency later. In this case, it's saying failure of the buyer to make this deposit or this deposit as required by this purchase contract. When did it say the initial earnest money deposit needs to be in escrow? By the next business day. If they don't put the earnest money into escrow by the next business day, what does that mean? They're in default.
Yeah.
And the buyer can elect to terminate. You gotta be aware of that. You might, a seller might call you up and say, hey, you folks didn't get your open escrow in time, we're canceling you. If they have a better offer, they have a way to get out now. Now your buyer just lost the house. If they don't make it here, within 3 business days after J1, so on the 4th business day, they didn't make the additional deposit, what happens? They're in default. And we'll talk about O1 and default, but generally, when they're in default, it means the seller can make a claim for their deposits. Okay? So this is very important to know. Okay, any questions? Next section, E, the property. E just says, it's just stating what the property is, okay? So you put in the TMK. By the way, it's already on the first page of the contract, but we're seeing now what the property is. So the property with the proper TMK, and that it is either fee simple or leasehold. And in this case, the property is situated at, and you just need to put in the address of the property. It doesn't have to be a legal description, just the property address is sufficient. Described as follows, and the follows will be a 3-bedroom, 2-bath house with an attached carport. Okay? If you want, you can go into a little more detail, but it's not necessary. You can say a 3-bedroom, 2-bath house that's 1,900 square feet with 5,000 square feet of land, but it's not necessary. And then you can add, if you want, legal description to follow in escrow. Okay? It's not necessary to put that because it's kind of redundant, because it says right here, the legal description will be provided. So that's an easy part of the property description, section E1. E2 talks about inclusions. Okay? Sale includes all built-in fixtures, furniture, and appliances, built-in appliances, the water heater, the electrical, the plumbing, and anything that is checked here. Where do you get this information from?
The listing.
The listing, exactly. You pull it off of the listing, the MLS. In fact, you should follow whatever, because in the MLS, it will list all non-built-in appliances, okay? And you're gonna check them as included in the MLS. Also, a good practice always is to print a hard copy of the MLS from the minute you see it, print it out. Because if it's ever changes made to it, you have a hard copy of saying, hey, it was included, it was already included. If the agent takes it off later and tries to backpedal on you, you'll say, well, this is what the MLS said, okay, when the offer was made. Okay? Because sometimes they'll put in the wrong things there. Also, sometimes you may put the wrong things in here. If the MLS says that it does not include the dryer, and you select that the dryer is to be included, and at closing, the buyer says, why is there no dryer? It was because you made a mistake. Who pays for that dryer?
You.
Probably you, okay? So the best thing to do is to just print up the MLS, and whatever is included, whatever's listed as inclusions, check them off here. Donna?
Well, sometimes when they want something, say, because like you submitted that, it didn't say it in the MLS, the dryer, but then, you know, people wanted the dryer, and you checked it, then, you know, and they accepted it, then weren't they saying that, yeah, okay, we'll take, you know, we'll give them the dryer?
Yes, yeah, that's a good point. So if, in this case, it'll probably not be you that pays for the for the dryer. It's gonna be the listing agent that didn't catch it. Right, because you're submitting an offer saying these things are included with the offer. And if the listing agent doesn't catch it, they're probably gonna be the one paying for it. Okay. But a good practice is you take off whatever is off of the MLS, okay? Any questions? And then the other would be where you would put, if there's things that aren't just the standard check boxes here, if there's anything here that you want, like a storage shed that's in the back, right? You might want to include that, but that's what goes in the other.
Or homeowner's policy, insurance.
No, that's separate.
1 year.
No, these are personal items, personal
It's different.
property that's included in the sale, not the homeowner's policy. The next one, E3, is the inventory list. Generally, you're gonna mark that as NA. Also be aware that even if inventory is included in the sale of the property, you probably wanna handle this separate of the contract, because if you do this as the contract, then you know who cares what's on that list? The lender. And if it's, you know, depending on the home and what's in it, they might add value to it. Then it becomes very complicated. So you wanna leave inventory separate from the contract.
So the better way to do it then is just to say, even say you want some stuff, say NA, to not, so you're saying don't even use this?
Yeah, do a separate
Just do a
agreement
whole
and do like a
separate
bill of
thing.
sale.
Yeah.
Bill of sale.
I had that.
Because, you know, if it's a multi-million-dollar home and the furnishings in there, you know, furnishings in multi-million-dollar homes can be substantial in cost and value. And sometimes a lender will say, if that's included in the purchase price, we have to get all that furniture appraised and figure that into the purchase price. So then it just complicates things. So be aware of it, okay? E4, exclusions. Generally, it's going to be marked NA, but if you're the listing agent, or if it says on the MLS that something is excluded, like the $100,000 crystal chandelier hanging in the dining room is excluded, then make sure you put that in there. Okay? Otherwise, in most cases, it's going to be marked NA. Okay, and then section F. This is a long section. This is going to take up the rest of this class, and this is where we're going to stop. So section F talks about closing, and there's different paragraphs in it. So here, closing, for the purpose of this closing of the purchase contract, closing will be the date when all appropriate conveyance documents are recorded. So what does that mean? When does the buyer own the property? We say at closing. What does closing mean?
Recordation.
At recordation. Okay, you have to be aware of this, especially if you have clients from the mainland, because there are places where the day they sign is the day they get the keys and own it, but not in Hawaii. In fact, how many days does escrow have to get all of the signed conveyance documents and everything else at the Bureau of Conveyance prior to recording? Does anybody know? It's 48 hours, right? All the conveyance documents that's going to be recorded at the Bureau has to be at the Bureau 48 hours prior to recordation. So is it possible for the client to sign the closing documents and close on the same day? No, because it has to be, once they sign it, then it has to go to the Bureau 48 hours ahead of time. So be aware that some people, especially when they come from the mainland, they don't understand that. So the closing, when they go in to sign at escrow, they think that's going to be the day they get keys. It is not. It's going to be at least 48 hours. And come August 1st, it may be even longer than that, because of substantial changes coming in the truth in lending disclosures with lenders. That 48 hours is going to actually be a lot longer. So be aware of that. The closing date for the purpose of this purchase contract is the date that everything records, whenever that date is, but it's not the date that they sign. Any questions? F2, the scheduled closing date shall be 45 days after acceptance or a date. You can put either one, a date or 45 days or 30 days or however many days after acceptance. What does 45 days after acceptance mean?
After the seller has, yeah.
Okay, so after the seller, what, counters?
Accept
Accept.
the offer.
Well, what if they accept it by way of a counter?
Not yet.
From
Not
the
yet.
counter.
So it's the date that both parties mutually agree to the document, right? So if there's counters and counter back and counter, it's the day that everybody says, okay, we've got a deal. That's the acceptance date, okay?
So that is, you can change it depending on the agreement between the two parties. Like, it could be 45, it could be less than 45.
It's all negotiable, right? If the seller doesn't like this, they may counter a different date.
So with that new thing that's coming after August 1st, it's probably gonna be like longer. I mean, if there's financing involved, yeah, or?
That is yet to be seen. They're saying you want to build in an extra week, but 45 days, lenders can close now. They can pretty much get the loans done now in 30, we're back down to 30 days. So 45 days is still pretty safe, but work with the lender. You want to always talk to the lender, say, is there going to be an issue? Right? If it's FHA, it may take a little longer. You always want to communicate with the lender to say, hey, I'm trying to shoot for as quick a closing. Are there any issues? Call and work with the lender.
Yeah, because we went to the conference last week, the TILA risk spotting, They said it can lengthen the closing by up to 60 days now because of the paperwork.
It could. So again, work with the lender. But you don't want to assume 60 days because 60 days makes your contract a little uglier. Right? Again, all things being equal, I have one buyer that has a contract offer to close in 30 days, another one offering to close in 60 days. Everything else is equal, which is the better offer?
Yeah, the closer, shorter.
The one in 30 days, right? But you don't want to assume that the lender can, so that's what I mean, you always work with the lender. Say, hey, we're making an offer, and by the way, this should not be the first discussion you have with the lender. You should have talked to them many times prior to that. And just talk to them saying, what kind of closing dates are we looking at? Right? So that's going to be what's going to be put in here. What does it say here? The scheduled closing date falls on, if it falls on a day that the bureau is closed, then the closing will be on the next day when documents can be recorded. So it's the next day, not the prior to. Okay? F3. This is one that most agents don't understand. So this says, change to the scheduled closing date, F3. This is also known as the extension, right? If a buyer can't make, or seller, okay, it's not just the buyer. Sometimes the seller can't meet the closing date either, okay? But in most cases, it's the buyer that needs to extend because of the loan. But it says here, extensions. First of all, there's no automatic right to extend. So you have to have a reason to extend it, okay? But if for reasons beyond the buyer's or seller's control, a party cannot perform its obligation to close by the scheduled closing date, then such party may extend the closing date up to, and there's a blank. 10 days is a little long. I'm not saying to put 10, this was already pre-filled in with another contract that we took off. So we're not saying put in 10 days. In fact, I think our template is 7 days, I think. But again, always thinking through when I'm drafting a contract, does a longer time frame make this uglier or prettier?
Uglier.
Right, uglier to a seller, right? But whatever it is, you fill in that amount. You put in that many days. 7 days is more realistic. 5 to 7 days is prettier. Okay, but you have to extend it by delivery of a written notice to the other party. Now this is the part that most agents don't realize when they extend it. Thereafter, time shall be of the essence, and if a party fails to perform by the extended closing date, such party is considered to be in default. What does that mean? So I have a buyer that we have a closing date on June 1st. Right? And he has 10 days to extend it.
Business days?
What does it say? Up to 10 days, right?
Yeah.
10 calendar days.
Calendar days.
So I have a June 1st closing, buyer can't make it, so they're gonna exercise that right to extend by 10 days. The buyer needs to know that at this point, if they do not close, time is of the essence, and if they don't close by that 10 days, then they're deemed to be in default.
You can ask for another extension.
You can ask for another extension, but a seller doesn't have to
They don't
give it
have
to you.
Oh.
And if they cannot close by that 10th day, the buyer is in default. Default means their deposits are in jeopardy, are at risk. Okay? Be aware of that. Your buyer needs to be aware of that. And then if, you can either put there's an extension or time is of the essence. Okay, that's the two choices, either A or B. If you're ever working with distress sales, like short sales or bank-owned properties, then there is no extension. Time is of the essence, they don't give you extensions. Okay? F4, escrow. This is saying who escrow is going to be, right? The escrow company, the address, the escrow officer. Always check the MLS because in many cases the sellers will say use such and such. Some they specify who they want to use escrow. Now you can put anybody here, and in theory the buyer gets to choose escrow. But if you put a different escrow company here than what the seller is saying to, what's the likely outcome?
The buyer has the right.
No, if the seller says use First American and Leanne Shimabukuro, and they put that in the MLS, and you go, ha, I'm going to use Old Republic John Doe as the escrow officer. What's the likely outcome?
They're gonna refuse your offer.
Yeah, either they're not going to take it if they have other offers, or they're going to counter you with the right one. So yes, the buyer gets to choose it, but in all likelihood, you're going to get countered or rejected. And off of this, off of something as simple as the escrow. So don't do it. If it says use that company, as long as it's a reputable escrow company, then use them.
It depends on the situation too. If there's a lot of offers, then probably the seller gets his way. But
Yes.
if there's no offer, then the buyer can choose.
Yes, in fact, good point. So I have an escrow, a listing right now where I said use a certain one, right? And the buyer, because they're in escrow for another property, and they wanted to make it simple because we're going to do a simultaneous close, asked if they can use that escrow company that their property is being closed at, and that was fine. F5, prorations. Prorations and closing, so it says here, prorations are based on a 30-day proration, escrow shall prorate everything, blah, blah, blah. So this is just saying that anything that's prepaid is going to be prorated as of the date of closing. Okay? F6, closing costs. So this just says typically what the buyers and the sellers pay for, what is customary. Now, does it mean that that's set in stone? No. Remember, everything in a real estate, in the purchase and sale of real estate, every single thing is negotiable. Right? As long as it's all negotiated prior to acceptance, but all the terms and contingencies are all negotiated, everything is negotiable. But these will be the customary closing costs. Also, be aware that if it's a bank-owned property, sometimes they make you pay for all of they won't pay for any of these things. They make the buyer pay for it all, sometimes. And in other times, they'll pay for all of it, so it just depends. But just be able to explain to the client that these are the customary breakdown of costs. Conveyance tax, F7. Pursuant to the conveyance tax law, nothing can be recorded until a conveyance tax certificate is filed and paid. And that's why escrow will always collect that conveyance tax up front from the seller's proceeds. Seller always pays the conveyance tax. But here, you do check one as the buyer's agent, that the buyer intends to use it as either their principal residence or as other than their principal residence. What does that mean, other than their principal residence?
Vacation homes.
Could be vacation or, in most cases, investments. But you have to select one or the other as the buyer's agent, because it does impact, the property tax is dependent on if the purchaser is an owner occupant or an investor or a non-owner occupant.
For a foreigner, where does it go? If he's if he's not a resident, he's a foreigner. Where does HARP come in? Or
That actually comes up in the later, comes up later. Also be aware that it's the buyer that's responsible to provide written notice that the sale has taken place. Okay, just be aware of it. Does the buyer actually have to give the written notice? No. Escrow will do all of that. But one of the documents that you sign, that the buyer signs at closing, is the conveyance tax certificate. So escrow does a lot of things that the buyer is responsible for, that they have no idea what they're signing. This is one of them. The conveyance tax, the burden is on the buyer to deliver it to the tax department that the sale has taken place. But even though the burden is on the buyer, that's one of the things escrow does. But be aware of it, okay? F8, assessments. If there are any assessments to a property, then it's handled this way. Either, if there are any lump sum assessments, then you check that the seller is going to be paying it off, or if the buyer is going to assume it. Okay? And then if there are any assessments that are levied against the property prior to the acceptance date, who's going to pay for that? That's an important one, especially if there are ongoing assessments in like a condominium, that you address that. Who's paying that off? Right? Is the buyer going to assume it, or is the seller going to pay it off? That also becomes a negotiating point. I'm in escrow to close on a condo in Makiki, and there's a big assessment on it. And so we factored that assessment into the offer price. You have to be aware if there are assessments, okay? And this we'll talk about, and so this paragraph F8 addresses who's to pay off any existing or future assessments. F9, consents. Buyer and seller may be required to obtain consents from lessors to make the conveyance the conveyance of the property. So they have to register with lessors, get lessor consents, and homeowner or condominium or co-op consents. And this is just saying that buyer and sellers agree to cooperate and take all reasonable actions necessary to get those consents done. F10, risk of loss. Risk of loss passes to the buyer upon recordation or possession. Okay? So what does that mean? Upon closing or possession. So if the buyer takes early occupancy of a unit, risk of loss then passes to the buyer. So if you've got an early occupancy situation, you got to understand that. Okay? Risk of loss passes to the buyer if they take early occupancy. Possession. Possession. Seller shall give buyer possession of the property at closing, or you can put in upon recordation. Which, if you read, the previous paragraphs, closing is upon recordation, so it's almost redundant. That would change in the case of a seller is going to lease back, right? Then you would address this. Possession will be something other than at closing. They're not going to get it until after the seller vacates. Seller may say, we need to occupy the unit for 30 days after closing. Then that would be different, okay? F12, keys to the property at seller's sole cost and expense. They shall provide to the buyer with all existing, but at least one set of functioning keys. Includes everything, mailbox keys, security keys, parking area, garage doors, everything. The seller must give at least one set. So in a condominium where they give 2 security keys, but seller only delivers 1 set, is that sufficient?
Yes.
Yes, as long as they give 1 set. Now, if an association requires a deposit to be made on keys, like access keys or things, then the buyer must pay the deposit.
So what happens if the seller has 2 sets of keys?
Then you
Does
give
he
it to
need-
them.
Oh yeah, do you give both sets instead of 1, because the requirement is only 1?
Yes. You're only required to give 1, but do you need the keys after you close?
I don't know.
You don't
Some
know?
of them might-
Why would
might
you
be a
need
hoarder.
keys to a place after you
Right,
close?
yes, you do.
What do you mean you don't know? You're scaring me, Henry.
But do you need to ask the seller that, do you have other sets of keys? Because who knows, it's for safety. If he doesn't know that, then he changes all the keys then.
Right, and so, right here. It is strongly recommended that buyer rekey their locks.
Yeah.
You should automatically do that, even for your own real estate. You should rekey your real estate, except for like the security doors in a condominium. You don't have power of that. But the door to the unit, you should rekey it anyway. So really, for my buyers, I tell them, don't worry if you only get 1 key, you're gonna rekey it anyway.
Okay, that's-
But, yeah, so generally, the seller will give all keys that they have. This paragraph is just saying, but they have to give at least 1 complete set. If they have more, they'll hand over whatever they have, because they have no use for it after they close on them, right?
Yeah,
Okay.
but there are stupid
Just wanna make sure.
sellers. Or can they charge the buyer for the extra sets of keys they have instead of getting it from the homeowner, from downstairs?
I'm sorry, what was the question?
Can the seller charge the buyer for the second set of keys?
No, you just tell them get their own set of keys. Why would they charge them for it if they
Because
don't have it?
he ultimately will get another set of keys, pay it, not from the seller.
But they have to change keys anyways,
Oh,
right?
so that's just,
Useless.
Yeah,
okay,
if
I
the
got you.
buyer, the seller would have nothing to charge the buyer,
Oh.
because the buyer, if the buyer wants another set, they go to get it, not the seller.
Yeah.
Okay?
Okay.
So that rounds off the first round of paragraphs. We went up to paragraph F. So next Tuesday, we'll pick up with paragraph G, and we'll continue through the next third of the contract. Was this helpful?
Yeah.
Okay, you really, the way, and then on the last day, we're actually gonna teach you how to actually close buyers using the sales contract. It's a really powerful way to get a buyer that says, oh, I wanna think about it, oh, I'm not sure, oh, whatever it is. Right, using a sales contract to say, look, let's make the offer. Would that be helpful to know that if you have a buyer that's kind of hemming and hawing and you can't get them to pull the trigger, how you would use a sales contract to say, look, let's make the offer, and have them feel comfortable about making an offer. Would that be helpful? Good, that's what we'll cover in the last session. So next week, we'll continue on G with paragraph G, okay? Thanks, guys.
Thank you very much.